This project records conversations that took place over a number of years between Thierry Chessum, Paul Fisher-Davies and me, John Miers. The purpose of these conversations was to find points of compatibility, or perhaps to identify and reinforce areas of irreconcilable disagreement between the three theoretical frameworks that each of us had based our doctoral research on. As you can see from the titles of our theses that are displayed at the bottom here, they are quite different. Thierry's work was based in Deleuzian philosophy, Paul drew on Hallidayan functional linguistics, and my thesis was based in cognitive linguistics in general and conceptual metaphor theory and other theories of metaphor more particularly. And after years of discussion, it felt that as we reached the end of our doctoral processes, that it was a good opportunity to actually try and pin some of this stuff down, and we were all very interested in the idea of trying to do that in comics form. One precursor to this is the Conversations comics jams published by Top Shelf. In this one, Jeffrey Brown and James Kachalka discuss approaches to comics production, which is something that we do touch on in our project, but our starting point was more about trying to triangulate three different theoretical positions.
A second inspiration was the idea, or rather the methodology, of verbatim theatre. In verbatim theatre, people record interviews with individuals about whom then a theatre piece is to be devised. So the recordings are made, transcribed and edited into performable drama with the aim to make the concepts cohesive to an audience. Now, verbatim theatre typically has a political aim. In our purposes, it's simply to disseminate academic ideas, but nonetheless that sense of taking actual conversation and turning it into some form of art, or at least communication, is shared. Initially, and as something of a false start, we attempted to record like about an hour of unstructured discussion between the three of us, which was very fluid and free-flowing, but after Thierry transcribed this, we found that it was far too complex and lengthy to manage to fit into a comic. So our second approach at methodology was to try and contain this a little bit more. We proposed to write for one another 5 questions for which each of us would have 1 minute to respond, thereby kind of containing the amount of talk that we would need to fit in. So here are Thierry's questions, from which John and I could choose to answer 2. This then would try and narrow down the amount of recording and the amount of transcription that we had to cope with so that it might fit better into a comic.
We recorded this conversation on the 2nd of May 2018. We sent each other selfies so that we could see what we were wearing that day, as to give us a reference to try to keep character design consistent. But as you'll shortly see, Paul did a much better job of actually using that than I did. Frankly, by the time we came to draw them, I'd actually forgotten that we'd even taken these. So here's an example of the transcript. One of the immediate hurdles that we faced here was that we've just got a lot of words that we need to try and condense into comics pages. Something not mentioned so far was that we also had a sense of urgency in getting this down, because Thierry at the time was suffering from cancer, which was progressing quite aggressively, and he'd warned the two of us a number of times that he was frankly not sure how long he would have left to be able to work on the project. In an email exchange where this document here was put together by Paul, so where he shared with the two of us this first unedited transcript, Thierry responded, "Most interesting, and reads fluently too. Alas, just as we were getting somewhere, I managed to fall at the first hurdle. Don't write me off completely just yet, but project prospects not very good at the moment. Out of hospital, into the sick bed. This is what comes of leaving things too late." And unfortunately, to say the least, Thierry was, after that point, not able to contribute to the project any further. He passed away a couple of weeks after this. And so this left Paul and I with, well, on the one hand, a very strong feeling that we had to get this project completed anyway, that leaving aside our interest in producing it, well, we we owed it to our friend, really, to try and see this through. This is a document that I created with, yes, as you see, really really inviting colour classification. But this is just an example of how I at least went about trying to trim down the full transcripts and turn them into things that had the brevity that is necessary to be translated into comics pages. For Paul and I, the process of producing these drawings was quite closely related to our use of sketchnoting at conferences. Obviously, as individuals who both produce and study comics, we're of course interested in how multimodal techniques can serve as ways of kind of capturing or recording knowledge, but also we hope we're not being arrogant in thinking that producing and sharing this kind of work has a service to the scholarly community to which we belong, and that doing this sort of thing emphasises the social nature, the interactive nature of knowledge production, and that absolutely is one of the core themes of this project here.
So for my part, I approach this task much as I would have in sketchnoting a conference. I had the advantage of a transcript of the actual words, and here the aim is to be rather more faithful than I can possibly be when sketchnoting live. But I use some photo reference, as you see appearing here, to help aid this digital format of sketching, but other than that, just kept things sort of improvised to some degree, panel by panel, seeing how the response to the recordings emerged in writing, whilst attempting drawings of the people involved as well.
These were the first 2 pages that Paul and I each completed. The idea was that each of these minutes of discussion that had been produced in response to the questions that we'd set would be transcribed into a 1 page of comics. But as you can see on the right here in my page, I just got carried away with messing around with fancy layouts, which then continue onto this page. And I do remember feeling quite strongly at the time, and perhaps bearing in mind that a significant aspect of this project is commemorative as well as theoretically inquisitive. I just felt that it was important to have scenes that established that this is 3 friends in a room talking, and that is part of its scholarly content. An obvious and challenging problem that we faced was how to handle the pages that Thierry would have drawn. One of the first things that we explored there was through dialogue with his partner, Sharon Finmark, who Paul and I have been very pleased, very grateful to be able to develop a friendship with. As you can see from this image, Sharon herself is an accomplished illustrator, and she produced this in response to the ideas that Thierry was working with. You can see key aspects of Deleuzian terminology used within this image, but she's not a cartoonist, and overall it would have been both technically and emotionally too great a burden to place on her to ask her to kind of engage with the completion of this project in the way that we were committed to. You'll see a little later in the presentation how, with her permission, we made use of this image as part of the finished document.
Sharon also brought to us a range of drawings that Thierry had done of himself during several stages of his life, and we were thinking about using those drawings so that Thierry would have a presence there on the page. Actually, we found that the drawings that he had made for his own thesis turned out to be the most useful and usable for us. So this meant a little bit of revision and also a bit of a quandary. I drew Thierry here, and you see these 2 versions on the screen, with a jumper superimposed over his self-drawing of himself in a checked shirt, because going back to the earlier selfies which we produced for continuity, he was wearing a jumper on the day, or at least that was the image that he sent to us. But John had drawn him without that jumper, and so we needed to decide whether we were going to remove the jumpers and keep him in a check shirt, so there were more of his lines present. And so in this following page I also added checks in and removed the earlier jumper that I had done, so these are my lines but representing Thierry in a more consistent way. I commented at the time in an email to John that I didn't like it as much having the checks, but if it makes the whole make sense, then that's comics. The cohesion and keeping the characters consistent from page to page was going to be really important for this project, particularly given the density of the content and the way that it leaps about in time.
And here's the updated version of a page that we saw earlier, where I've given Thierry a checked shirt and myself a red jumper in order to maintain that consistency. As the project developed, one of the aspects that was most enjoyable, while also being very challenging both technically and in terms of workflow, was that the sort of level of collaboration became ever closer. So here we see an unfinished page that Paul has begun using that technique we saw a little earlier of bringing in some of Thierry's own drawings, but he's also there left gaps for me to fill in where my dialogue appears within this section of the transcript. And so then this was my version of a page that was left incomplete for Paul to top and tail. I think you can see there that the drawings of Thierry are his own, and in some of those they're taken from different strips, so in some of those he's not given himself a check shirt and I've had to draw them back in, and in other cases his own checks are left in there. When I sent this to Paul, I commented that this felt like the most fully collaborative bit of the drawing process so far, using Thierry's self-portraits, leaving panels for you to fill, knowing that the next bit would be filling in panels that you've left for me. And this page also being the first one in which I've adopted the agreed representational conventions from the start rather than going back in and adding them. And following on from that, I also said, well, I might be reaching here, but the process could be framed as embodying the functionalist position on meaning making, particularly with regard to our discussion of my question to you about how and whether different modes of communication can be considered to have congruity of purpose. In both cases, i.e. the initial conversation and the production of these pages, it's been necessary to observe and respond to one another's representational habits in order to achieve coherent dialogue. Paul responded to that by saying, not reaching at all, or at least reaching no more than I would. The choices of resources we knew we'd have at our disposal led us to structure the conversation in a way that we thought would fit into panels and pages. We took selfies to try for consistency in representation, which we failed on anyway. So these are the finished versions of the pages that we saw incomplete on the last few slides, and I've not really said anything so far about the meat of the theoretical discussion, and obviously going into that in detail would be another paper entirely, but might just be worth highlighting one little section here. This response from Paul, a structuralist sort of linguistics is not the only linguistics. This I think is significant because coming to this realization was a way of getting over one of what seemed like the most obvious apparent sort of incompatibilities between our theoretical frameworks. So Paul and I are both using frameworks that have linguistics in the title. Thierry, as a good Deleuzian, is very suspicious of linguistics, feeling that it's overly prescriptive in terms of the model of meaning making that it provides. But actually, it's not all of linguistics that Deleuze is sceptical of. It's structuralist linguistics in particular. It's the idea that there can be any kind of fixed correspondence between signs and their reference, or that the relationships between signs and their reference can be understood through a process of decoding. But such assertions are not parts of functionalist linguistics nor of cognitive linguistics. Cognitive linguistics focuses on the cognitive processes by which utterances are produced and understood, and emphasizes the multimodal nature of cognition. And functionalist linguistics focuses on communication as an activity. And it's the purpose is the types of interpersonal knowledge sharing. That's what's emphasized in functionalist linguistics rather than looking at syntax and looking at structure. And I think, yeah, as I say, I think sort of realizing that was something that was quite key in terms of allowing us to begin finding points of compatibility. So a couple of other production details. We did also make some small alterations to some of Thierry's drawings in order to get them to fit into the strips a little bit better. So you can see on the left there that Paul has edited, has given him a smile and added a hand. And on the right there, I've sort of flipped his hands upside down to make it look as if he's gesturing rather than typing on a keyboard. And to pick up on that line earlier about sort of having reached this point of using the three sets of drawing together and how that started to feel more genuinely collaborative, Paul commented to me in an email on the 31st of October last year, "The act of creating has kept Thierry in mind. I have felt in dialogue with him afresh, not only in the attempt to stay faithful to what he might have found important to preserve in editing his words, but also in adapting his drawings and considering his lines and choices."
So our last task in pulling the project together was to make sure that the whole thing was relatively cohesive in terms of its structuring, ordering, page by page coherence, and also things like the colours and the colour balance, as well as bringing together all of the illustrations. So the front cover incorporated the piece that Sharon had so kindly done for us, and pulled together also the self-drawings of all of us, and also we introduced an inside front cover page that would just give the outline for a reader of what was happening, the way that we structured the questions, how long we had, because we refer to the procedure as we go throughout. We ended up starting with a couple of my pages, which are straightforward 9-panel grids, and it's just me writing, and also I think usefully starting with Thierry's account of Deleuze and the rhizome, which sort of sets you up for the kind of complexity that we're going to meet later. Also, we start with a very basic question of why do we need theory at all, since the piece will all be about theory. As we move through the next spread, then this is where we started to integrate Thierry's own drawings and our adaptations of that. And then John's drawing also comes in, and we're drawing each other, drawing in drag, as Grennan puts it, starting to imitate each other's styles right into each other. In each other's spaces, and take on one another's voices, both ventriloquizing the lettering as well as drawing in related styles to one another. So we then get some classic jam pages towards the middle where John and Thierry and my drawings are all integrated on the page. The drawing to the right here was done in layout by John, and then I drew in my interpretation of it over the top, which John reported being a really novel and interesting thing to happen, to have somebody else complete his sketch layouts. And so the next one was done reciprocally, where I laid out the page on the left here, and John drew much of it based on my layouts. The next section was actually John's first page, and here we get to some renderings of Thierry and renderings of all of us, reminding us what was going on here, that we were all sitting around this table with a recorder. I like the fact that the tape recorder is drawn differently in pretty much every rendering of it, which chimes with some of the points that we're making about the nature of drawing and how it carries assumptions that language just doesn't. The words tape recorder are repeated each time, but when one draws it, one is committed to specifics of the tape recorder that are not contained in that word itself. And then for the last couple of pages, we return to jams, and the lettering, for example, on the right here, John lettered in his own style for Thierry initially, then he's lettering in imitation of my style whilst drawing me, but then later on we thought it would be interesting for me to start to letter, especially when we're talking about changes in the self and coherency of self and playing of different roles, and then I think that's John imitating Thierry's lettering style as well later on. And so this needed to come to some kind of conclusion, and this page seemed like it would neatly capture it and be one of the endpoints, particularly with the three of us talking about how we feel our views, whilst they're very different, are nonetheless compatible, and with each of us drawn separately on our islands in our own hands. And the last touch then was to take some of the green, which we hadn't used, focusing on red and blue throughout, but which Sharon had. So we took the green from her front cover page and put it there as the grass of the island to give the piece a sense of overall shape and structure and keep the abstract qualities, colour and line, coherent through the piece. The last page isn't quite decided on yet, but we wanted to try and give Thierry the last word and draw attention back again to the methodology and structure. And so these were an edited form of about the last words, as Thierry summed up that we have a recording. And actually, we'd only recorded it with one device when we meant to do several. So Thierry needed to check that the recording worked. And as you can see, it did. And so thank you very much for having us both.